Hi, welcome back to Grains in Small Places, and today we're going to be making something kind of fun, I think. We're going to be making a Ruff Puff pastry, and we're making it with fresh milled flour. And we're going to be using that Ruff Puff pastry to make some delicious apple turnovers. So let's get started. While we were in the area, we checked out a local apple house and found some beautiful apples. So we had to, of course, get some and make something delicious with them. If you want to buy apple pie filling or any pie filling from the store and skip this step, feel free, go right ahead and do that. Okay, so I thought it would be a great idea to make a double batch of the filling. That way I could put some in the freezer, and the next time I want to make turnovers, I've already got the inside part done, so I can just have turnovers in less than an hour and a half the next time I want to make them. So these are called ginger gold apples. They are kind of a mix between a yellow and a green apple. You could of course use, whatever apple variety you prefer. So I recommend going ahead and slicing them in half, and we're going to core them, get the seeds out, and I went ahead and of course peeled them. It's okay if they get a little brown because of course we're going to end up dicing these and cooking them. I do recommend more of a probably sour apple or not a super sweet apple for these because we are going to be adding in some sugar. But if you do have a sweet apple, I'm sure they would work just fine. And we're going to be dicing these into, probably about 1/3 of an inch squares as best as we can. You all know I'm not great at that measuring and consistency, so we'll see how this goes. Just going to put those right into the pan that we're planning on cooking with, and then we'll add our seasonings to that. Okay, they are all diced up in our pot, ready to go. This is probably about, I used 4 smaller apples. You could use 3 medium to large apples. This may be a little too many. We'll see how far it goes, but this was just my estimate of how much I would need to make the turnovers. So we're gonna put this in a pot with about 1 tablespoon of butter and start cooking them until they're softened. Okay, this is gonna be our tablespoon of butter, and I'm gonna put that on medium-high heat and start cooking those till they soften. I'm gonna make sure I just stir these often. I guess it would have been better if I had put the butter down in the pan before the apples, but I don't think we'll have a problem. Let that cook down. For these to soften, probably takes about 5 to 7 minutes, depending on the kind of apple you're using. Some of them are softer apples and some of them are crispier apples, but you just want them to start to be soft here and cooked. And then we're going to add in our sugar. We're going to use about 1/4 of a cup of brown sugar. But before we add our sugar, I'm going to put our temperature down to low so we don't burn anything to the bottom of the pan. And I'm going to put the sugar. To that we're going to add 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt and 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon. That was my 1/8 teaspoon measuring cup, which is why I did that many, but I really like to use this Ceylon cinnamon. It is the cinnamon that has all of the antioxidants. I can put a link to that below in the description box if you're interested. I had kind of a hard time finding it. It also has a little bit of a different flavor than the traditional cinnamon that you can get. It's nice and warm and homey, and it reminds me kind of those, if you've ever been to the craft stores around Christmas time, it just has that beautiful cinnamony smell to it. So we're just going to mix that around and cook it on low. to medium low. I want it to pretty much almost simmer but not boil, and cook that for about 3 more minutes. And we want the apples to be soft and caramelized before we pull them off. So let's just cook those down a little bit. Okay, this is smelling amazing. Just like a fresh apple pie, and that's what we want, because obviously this is going to be kind of like a apple pie filling. You could of course make this in many different flavors. You could do cherry, you could do peach, blueberry, raspberry, whatever flavors you're wanting. These just happen to be what are in season, and we saw those beautiful apples at the apple house where we were and wanted to try making them with something local where we are. Okay, those look good. They're nice and softened, they're browned. There's not any like super hard chunks left. Like here's a big one, but I can just slice that right through. So remember, when we put this inside of the turnovers, it's also going to get baked in there as well. So I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to put this to the side and let it to start to cool down. We do not want to put this mixture in our puff pastry while it is warm at all. So I'm just going to let this sit to the side to let it cool down, and while this is cooling, we can go ahead and start working on the puff pastry. Okay, we're going to be using soft white wheat today. It's a delicate pastry, so we want to definitely use something that is soft here, not hard wheat. So I'm going to go ahead and weigh out my wheat berries. I'm going to start out with 240 grams of soft white wheat. You could use soft red wheat, maybe some einkorn or spelt, kamut, anything that doesn't really form the gluten would probably work pretty well, but you may have to adjust the amount that you're using slightly, because each wheat berry holds a little bit of a different moisture content. There we go. Okay. So we just got to keep that in mind. Even between soft wheat and soft wheat, hard white and hard white, different varieties, different cuts of the season, the moisture content can be different with those as well. So let's take this over to the mill, and we'll go ahead and mill it into some flour. And I decided to use my little secret ingredient to add to my flour to make it lighter and fluffier. I added about 1/8 a cup of potato starch, but you can also use cornstarch. I just use potato starch because we have a corn sensitivity issue in our house. Okay, here is our soft white wheat flour. Let's take that over. Okay, so here is our fresh milled flour. Right after we mill this, it is warm. So we want to make sure that we do let it cool down just a little bit before we add the butter to it. So I'm going to go ahead and add the salt, which is going to be about 1/2 teaspoon. This is my 1/4 teaspoon measuring spoon because my others are dirty. I'm just going to use a fork to stir that in and to also allow this to cool down a little bit. So while this is cooling down, I'm going to set it to the side, and then I'm going to show you what we're going to do with our butter. Okay, so I wanted to share with you one major point or tip when you're making puff pastry or really any laminated dough is you want to get a good European butter. American butter, while I love it and I use it for just about everything that I make except for laminated doughs, is wonderful, but it has a higher moisture content. So that's why some of these things don't work out with our American butter. So I do use cheap American butter in my cookies, cakes, you name it, I use it, baking, cooking, everything. But for laminated doughs or puff pastries, croissants, anything like that, you're gonna wanna use a little bit better butter that has a lower moisture content. So I just wanted to share with you that little tip. Okay, so what we're going to do with our higher quality, lower moisture butter is I'm going to use 2 sticks of it. Don't worry, I'm going to put the recipe link down in the description box below. That way you know all of the amounts. But you can just see the difference in the color of the butter even. It's a little bit more yellow. It's a little thicker. So we're starting with cold butter. And actually, I got a giant box of it at Sam's Club. I believe Costco carries it as well. So it's a little bit of a tip for more money saving, I guess. But what we're going to do is just grate this butter, just like we would cheese. And this is going to give us the perfect size butter pieces for our puff pastry. Now, there are some people that will freeze the butter first to do this portion, and you can do that if you would like. It does make it a little bit easier to shred, but I did forget to put this in the freezer, so we're just doing it as is. Just watch your fingers. I just got to get it out of there because it does like to stick, so it kind of looks like cheese now. I like to keep the paper on because it tends to protect my fingers a little bit better. And it also doesn't let the butter melt as quickly into my hands. But when I get down to the bottom, sometimes there's not much you can do when I get to that little piece. So when I get to that little piece, I just like to toss it in here, and then I will just cut it up. Probably with my fork. Okay, second one, we want to make sure this is staying cold. We do not want this to be softened in any way. So again, I just lost a super expensive stick of butter on the floor. Oh, it's a sad day. Guys, you know I have dogs. I can't just pick that off the floor and eat it. Okay, new butter stick. So I guess I'm glad that I bought the big Sam's Club pack, because otherwise I would have not been able to finish this recipe. Alright, same thing. We're going to shred this up. And you could cut this into cubes, but I really find that this shredding method makes the perfect size for our puff pastry. It's not too thick because we still want some little butter discs left after we're done mixing this. Okay, just about to that end. I'm just going to pop that in there and cut those two pieces up. Okay, and I want to make sure that I get all the butter out of here too. So I want to try to use my hands as least as possible, because if I touch these little shreds of butter, they're going to melt pretty quickly. And luckily it's not super hot today. Just gonna cut these. If it was a super hot day, it would be very beneficial to have these in the freezer, but it's kind of gloomy out today, so that's kind of why I was craving some apple turnovers, because it has that feeling of fall. Okay, so what we're going to do is take this butter and put it in our flour and salt mixture, which hopefully has cooled by now. Let me just give it another mix to let the cooler air in. If it's still slightly warm, I would recommend popping this in the refrigerator or waiting a little bit longer, but keeping this in the refrigerator if you need to wait for this a little bit longer, because otherwise it will melt sitting out at the counter. Okay, so we're just going to take these shreds. Again, I don't really want to use my hands here because that's going to melt this much faster. So the way puff pastry works is the butter expands while the baking happens, and that is what gives us our puff. So when we laminate it into layers, that is how we get our puff pastry. So that's why we don't want to melt the butter or anything. We want to have little pieces of butter in there, kind of how I make my biscuits. I like to see just a little bit of the butter pieces poking out at me while I'm rolling that out. I don't want it completely incorporated. So I actually, let's see. So some of these are larger chunks. So let me go ahead and get my pastry cutter, which you can use as well. This is what I use for my biscuits and anything like that. So I'm just going to do this roughly. I do not want to incorporate this all together. And I can put a link below to the things that I'm using in this video if you're interested, like the mill and the pastry cutter and the baking silicone mat that I'm going to be using later on. Okay. So I like that texture. Again, I haven't really put my hands in here at all once the butter was in here. Just fluff that around. So you can see I have very large pieces of butter in here still. And I think I'm happy with that. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Okay, so I have a half a cup here or so of cold water. You may need a little more, you may need a little less. Just keep an eye on your dough. We definitely want this dough to remain on the drier, crumblier side, because the more we work with it, the more this butter is going to melt a little bit and hydrate this flour. So we want to make sure that we don't make this into a super wet or sticky dough. So I'm going to start out just putting about half of the amount of water in here and stir that around. Okay, I'm going to put about half of what's left in here. Okay, so now that this mostly is incorporated, I'm thinking, since you can see this is all the clump that we want, and then there's just a little bit of this like dried loose flour back here, I'm just going to put this little rest in here and mix that in with the drier dough. Okay, so you can see that this is going to be a dough that's going to hold together just by when I do that with my fork, but it's not so sticky that it's liquidy or anything like that. So I don't really want to work on this too much longer without putting it on my work surface. So let's head on over to the work surface and start that process. And I will show you how we get the laminated layers. I know this seems like a fussy or difficult recipe, but it's really a fairly simple recipe once you get the hang of it. And once you start, and then once you taste it, it really is an amazing recipe. This puff pastry does not have any sugar or sweetener in it, so it can be used for sweet or savory. That's one of the perks of this particular recipe. So let's head over to our work surface. Okay, so I milled some of this soft white wheat a little bit extra earlier so that it cooled down, because we don't want this to be hot either. So I mill that. You can either pop it in the fridge real quick to let it chill, or the freezer, or you can just mill it at the beginning so that it's all nice and cool before it starts. So I'm going to use a little rolling pin here and my pastry cutter. I love using this mat because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be rolling out this rectangle, and I'm wanting to basically do like, I came on this side because my mat isn't 20 inches this way. So I'm basically looking to do 6 inches wide by 20-inch rectangle as best as possible. When we first start working with the dough, let me grab it. Here it is. It's going to be shaggy and hard to work with. This comes in handy so that we can scrape it off of our mat rather than trying to fuss with it with our hands. So I'm just going to sprinkle the work surface here. And I'm going to put a little bit on there, a little bit on here. So this seems like it's kind of fussy how we're going to be doing these folds, but that is how we get our layers. So I promise it's not as difficult as it seems at first. Okay, so this is the first time I'm actually kind of touching my dough with my hands. It's still nice and chilled from the cold butter and the cold water. Just getting every little bit out here. Okay, so we're not necessarily wanting to knead this. That's not my intentions here. But we do want the dough to somewhat come incorporated. So I'm just going to give it a couple squishes to form this into a ball without overworking it, because we still want to keep these butter pieces all throughout here. So okay, so what we're going to do first is try to start out with somewhat of a rectangle. And again, like I said, it's going to be crumbly at first. So it doesn't have to be exact thickness. It doesn't have to be exact 6 by 20, or that's just about what we're looking for. So we don't want to make it too thin, because it will be very difficult to work with, but we don't want it thin enough to where we have our layers. So I want to make sure that we're still putting some flour on here. Okay, so what we're going to do first, this is pretty close here. That's okay if that happens, so just form it into a little ball, stick it back on here if you want, or you can toss it, whatever you want to do. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do what they call a letter fold. I want to make sure that this is not sticking to my table. If you don't have one of these, this might feel like kind of a nightmare here. So what I'm going to do is go about 1/3 down. The same thing on this side here. I'm going to do 1/3 here. As we work this dough, it's going to become easier to work with. So right now it does want to stick, and that's fine. That's completely normal. So what we're going to do now is take this, put a little bit more flour on our work surface, and we're going to turn it 90 degrees. Just going to put just a little bit. That might have been too much, because I don't want my rolling pin to stick. Then we're going to just go and roll about the same size rectangle as we just made. As best as we can. I just think this little rolling pin helps give me more control over the shape that I'm getting. Okay, I like that. So just going to work underneath the dough, and we're going to do the same fold, the letter fold here, where we're doing 1/3 of the dough and 1/3 of the dough. If it rips a little, that's fine. Then we're going to take this dough, put a little bit more of flour on our work surface, flip it 90 degrees. And we're going to do this one more time before we let this chill in the fridge. So this is actually a pretty quick recipe. Most of the time making this is chilling time, but every time we do this, we're getting more layers, and that's what we want. I don't want to put so much flour on these layers that I'm making like a biscuit layer. So just mind how much you're putting on here. Just only use the amount that you would need to make sure that it doesn't stick to your rolling pin. Okay, and this is going to be our last letter fold before we let it chill, and then we're going to end up doing the same thing. This little guy will be your best friend for this process. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this in some cling film so that I can pop it in the fridge. I may wrap it twice. And I can definitely tell it is starting to get soft from being worked with. Just want to make sure it's covered. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take this, cover it. I'm going to cover it one more way with saran wrap over there, and then I'm going to pop this in the fridge for 30 minutes. Okay, so while that chills, I just checked on our apple filling, and it's still a little bit warm. So this is going to end up working out time-wise perfectly, because in that half an hour of that chill time, that should be, the filling should be room temperature. So I'm just going to clean the sticky dough bits off of my mat here, and I'm going to clean this up so that we can use this on the next step without pulling the dough off of it. So I'm going to wash this up, but I'm going to leave my station here because I'm just going to come right back to it here in just a moment. Okay, so now that our pastry has been chilling, okay, I've still got my flour here. I've got an egg for an egg wash to seal the edges. I have our cooled apple mixture. Now again, this is a double batch of the filling, so we will end up putting some of that in the refrigerator. Or if you want to make a double batch of pastry, you can, but I would not recommend just doubling it and trying to roll it off in here. It probably would be better to roll them out separately rather than try to do it in a double batch. Okay. So there's that. I forgot to put some flour at the bottom of that, so just put a little bit on this. Okay, give that a flip. Okay, so now I'm actually going to go ahead and let this laminate this one more time that it's chilled. As you can see, it lifts up much easier, doesn't want to stick as much to my table. And I'm going to just pull that in like that and flip it 90 degrees. Make sure I've got some flour under here. So I'm going to roll this out to be about 11 inches or so square. So we're not going for rectangle this time. So we're doing this in a square so that we can cut it in quarters to make our turnovers. So this is helpful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're going to go. Okay, so we've got 11. Okay. Okay, so we've got our 11 by 11 inch square, and using a pizza cutter, I'm going to cut this in half. So about halfway here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is make sure that these are all loosened at the bottom so that I don't have anything stick. All right, so I have an egg wash here. I have 1 egg and about a tablespoon of water. And I'm just going to mix that up, and that's going to help us make our seal. I also have a parchment paper lined baking sheet. And we're going to use that so that nothing sticks. Okay, and I'm going to wash my hands real quick so I can put the mixture in here. Okay, nice and clean. So what I'm going to do is draw an imaginary line diagonally here, and I'm going to put the apple filling or whatever filling you decide to use in the center of this triangle, but I want to leave about a 1/2 inch around the edge so that I can put my egg wash here, and then we'll seal it together. So let me go ahead and get these filled with our cooled apple mixture. I'm going to say maybe about 2 tablespoons or 1.5 tablespoons of mixture probably will be about right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save the rest of this for future either hand pies or turnovers. So I'm just going to press this and make sure that it doesn't go past my imaginary line, and it doesn't go past my 1/2 inch border here. What I'm going to do now is take my little pastry brush and use this egg wash, and I'm just going to place this on the edges. This is going to serve as our glue. As we fold this piece over. And obviously I didn't do a great job making corners here, so. And I'm going to use this fork and I'm going to press around the edges, around that 1/2 inch. Okay. And then I'm going to use my little pastry cutter and put that on my tray. Let's see. This might be the best way. Okay, so we're going to end up getting 4 on here is my goal. And then I'm going to let these chill in the refrigerator for about 15 minutes or so, just to help everything to set and the glue to bond a little bit better. Try to match these up as best as we can, and I have some apple trying to peek out, so I want to make sure we don't have any of that going on. There's really nothing you can do to prevent a leakage completely, but there are things that we can do to help make it less likely to happen. One being the glue, another being, after these sit, I'll show you, but we're going to put a little bit of slits in here to help the steam escape. Let's see what we can do to fit this one. So if you have something like this, just gently try to form yourself a little triangle. All right. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is cover this back up and just let it sit in the refrigerator for about 15 minutes to let everything chill. And then I'm gonna get this cleaned up so that we can save this egg wash, cut the slits in, and then we can bake them and I'll show you what they look like. Okay, here they are, ready for the next step. So we're going to cut just 2 to 3 slits in the top just to let the steam escape. I'm going to go ahead and egg wash these and then we'll pop them in the oven, and then we'll also make a drizzled icing that we can put on top. These are going to bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 20 to 23 minutes or so until they are golden brown and kind of puffed up. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of make sure it goes all the way through. Okay, and if you had any of that thick sugar, that might be really good on the top of these also. So we're just going to egg wash these so they get that nice golden color. Don't want to go overboard, but I also wanted to make sure that these have about 1 inch apart from each other, so I'm trying the best that I can here. My oven is only so big, so my pans are only so big. So if you have a normal size 9 by 13 pan, you won't have an issue putting these about 1 inch apart. And if you of course wanted to make these into 8 smaller ones, just little mini turnovers, you could do that as well. I'm gonna check and see if I have any of that sugar right now. All I have is this like iridescent sanding sugar. I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit on there just for the flavor. So they may be a little bit on the shiny silver pearlescent color while done, but that's okay. They will taste delicious. And into the oven they go. Alrighty, and while those are baking, I'm going to take about maybe a ½ cup of powdered sugar and just a little bit of milk. You could use non-dairy milk. You could use dairy-free milk, whichever milk you prefer to use. You could even use water. Just gonna mix that in, probably about 1 to 2 tablespoons. That was about 1. I want to drizzle it, so I'm going to add a little more. Just to the texture that you desire. Okay, so that's probably good. We'll set that to the side till they're ready and we can drizzle it on later. Okay, they're done. We didn't really have any horrible spillages, so that's great. I'm going to just let these cool down on here for a little while before we put the icing on here. And then we'll go ahead and put the icing on, and then time to enjoy. Okay, I let them cool on the tray for about 10 minutes. I'm gonna go ahead and pull them off and put them on this wire rack to let them finish cooling the rest of the way. We wanna put this on while they're still warm, but not hot, so. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today while we made these apple turnovers with our Ruff Puff pastry made with fresh milled flour. Don't forget to check out my blog at grainsandsmallplaces.net where you can find this recipe and a whole bunch of other recipes all dedicated exclusively to fresh milled flour. So thank you for stopping by Grains and Small Places. Goodbye.